Now the story of
a rap group who fell off in the 90s,
and the one
YouTuber
who had no choice but to
make a video about them.
It's Arrested Development.
I am the Jaquio, and today's episode of Bad 90s Music focuses on a rap group with the now ungoogleable name of Arrested Development. They were a group who formed in 1988 in Atlanta, Georgia. They actually were one of the first rap groups from the South to gain the kind of popularity that they did. There were certainly other Southern rappers before them, but most of them didn't quite break through to the mainstream, even though they were able to get some popularity. Which is interesting because both Speech and Headliner are not from the South. Speech was the leader of the group, the main MC, and he's from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Headliner was from New Jersey. As for the rest of the members, I'm going to let them do their own bios. This is from the intro to their music video for Mr. Wendell.
Hey, yes indeed, this is Speech from Arrested Development, under leader. Hey, yes indeed, this is Speech from Arrested Development, under leader. Homeboy right over there, Headliner is the turntable instrumentalist. We got Ellie over there with a crazy stuff, chilling. Razadon is chilling, he's in the house. That's the man, he designs all our logos. And then we got Baba O'Jay in the house. He's like the papa, the father figure. Of course, I can't forget Ishi. Lady Smiley over here, always smiling. And of course, Larry's on the guitar. This song is for you, brother.
So that lineup, as far as I could tell, aside from Speech and Headliner, Erly Terry, who is one of their female vocalists, Rashadan, brother Larry, and Baba O'Jay. Arrested Development were a group who saw themselves very much in the tradition of Sly and the Family Stone. I think they tried very hard to be a Sly and the Family Stone for the 90s. And their approach to accomplishing that was to give themselves a more diverse lineup. They have an old man named Baba O'Jay, who is credited as an official member of the group. But as far as I can tell, I don't think he contributes any music or lyrics. You know, they have this old guy, Speech knew from back home. Later he found out that that Baba O'Jay was the best man at his parents' wedding. But you know, that's the kind of 90s group that they were. They were trying to be as socially conscious as possible, and they were trying to reach as wide of an audience as possible and just try to create more growth and more unity in what they saw as the stage of development that the black community was in. And that's where their name came from. They called themselves Arrested Development because they felt like the progress of black people in the United States had only gotten so far. They had not yet achieved true equality. Their way of trying to continue to pursue this was to create this really conscious, progressive style of hip-hop. It was political, but far less angry than groups like Public Enemy. It was antithetical to the gangster concerns. I think they came off as kind of shrill or sanctimonious to people at a lot of the time. But what they set out to do was essentially to bring a more spiritual and positive dimension to the rap music of the 90s, and critics ate it up at the time. The group was very successful right away. Their first album was released in 1992. It was called 3 Years, 5 Months, and 2 Days in the Life of, and the album title refers to how much time it took between when the band formed in the late 80s and when they got a record contract. And really, keeping track of exactly how many days it takes for you to get a record contract is a level of pettiness that I think most groups can only aspire to. They were successful pretty much right away with the first single from this album called Tennessee, which is still probably their biggest song. It uses a sample from Prince's Alphabet Street, where he says the word Tennessee, but it's all manipulated. Like, that's Prince. Prince actually did later sue them for sampling his voice without permission. The rest of the song doesn't take anything from Alphabet Street at all, just that one vocal sample. After the single became successful, and as soon as it dropped to about number 4, Prince went and sent his lawyers to charge them $100,000 for using his voice. Speech said in an interview that when they were putting together this track, they didn't know anything about sampling, they didn't understand how it worked. You see this happen with a lot of 90s rappers, actually. A lot of them end up getting their asses sued. It hurt a lot of careers. But in this case, Speech said that when he found out more about law, which had just recently changed, to prevent the sort of sample-heavy tracks that producers like the Bomb Squad and the Dust Brothers were doing at the time, rappers could no longer incorporate dozens of samples into a single song like they had been doing, so they were pretty much limited after this to about 1 or 2 samples per song if they wanted to afford to still produce it, basically. Later on, Speech did acknowledge that Prince could have gone after them for much more. You know, he could have gone after them for royalties, which would mean that he would still earn money from this song to this day, even though he's dead, so I guess that It's not true. Yeah, instead he just asked them for a straight up $100,000 to make the sample legit, and that was what they did. They paid him off because by then they could definitely afford to.
Lord, I've really been real stressed, down and out, losing grass. Although I am black and grass, problems got me pessimistic. Brothers and sisters keep messing up. Why does it have to be so damn tough?
What's interesting about Arrested Development is the kind of change that they're trying to effect is one that comes from within. It's more of a spiritual journey that they are advocating, rather than a change that would consist of, for example, tearing down the existing structures that allow institutional racism to continue in society. They're not so much about that kind of pointing fingers or trying to assign blame. Didn't always go over well with people because it just seemed to ignore that kind of situation. But this song, Tennessee, is very much an introspective song. The whole thing is basically a dialogue between Speech and God, admitting to how lost and confused and alienated he feels, and he's looking for guidance from a higher power in this song. Basically, this is the rap version of Jesus Take the Wheel. And then it turns out that the solution is to go back to the past. Arrested Development were a really Afrocentric band. Their concerns weren't always limited to just the treatments that the black population had endured in the United States. If Black Panther had been a 90s movie, I'm pretty sure Arrested Development would have done the soundtrack for it, because they did a song for the soundtrack to Malcolm X, which was the Black Panther of the 90s, essentially. And this rap still really sounds like nothing else from 1992. So the band had this really unique production. The rapping of Speech reminds me a little bit of Q-Tip from A Tribe Called Quest in the sound of his voice, if not the flow. And it's got kind of this melodic R&B chorus. So the mission of Arrested Development in this song is basically trying to challenge themselves to find the answers within, to try to find solutions to the turmoil that they feel. It is kind of an empowerment anthem in that sense. So we have Dion Farris doing the vocals on this outro. I think they used her first take, and she just sort of improvised this whole vocal melody. Dion Farris is not an official member of the group, and we'll come back to talking about her a little more later. She was, I think, signed to the same label as Arrested Development at the time, hadn't made a record yet, and they knew each other, so Arrested Development invited her to sing on a couple of songs, and she sings vocals on their biggest single, Tennessee, as well as the songs Fishing for Religion and Give a Man a Fish from their first album. This is the song Mr. Wendell. This is a song about homeless people, and it's interesting because most songs about homeless people sound a lot more dark than this, or a little more weird. Even Flow by Pearl Jam and Aqualung by Jethro Tull, which are both much darker and more depressing and weirder songs, but this song almost sounds a little uplifting.
Here, have a dollar. In fact, no, brother man, here, have two. $2 means a snack for me, but it means a big deal to you.
So Speech said that this song was based on a lot of the homeless population he had encountered when he was living in Atlanta. Mr. Wendell was not a specific real-life homeless man that he knew, but there are several of their experiences that he based on in this song. He says in this song that essentially our lifestyles of acquisition cause necessary inequality in society. People like Mr. Wendell and the other homeless are kind of the inevitable result, or the class-based structure that we have.
Mr. Wendell has freedom, a free that you and I think is dumb. Free to be without the worries of quick to this society. For Mr. Wendell's a bum. Uncivilized we call him, but I just saw him eat off the food we waste.
So it is a little bit of a naive type of take on the idea of the homeless people as, you know, spiritual leaders. I'm sure he knew a lot of them that were just crackheads or, you know, just people who couldn't hold down a normal life. In this song, his character, Mr. Wendell, is a person on sort of a higher plane of consciousness, kind of like a mad sort of philosopher, and he sort of uses that position of how we look down on people like this. We kind of use this as a way to make ourselves feel superior. So there are moments in the song that he tries to get past the issue of homelessness to try to find humanity. It does sort of work as that kind of a kind of socially conscious hip-hop song to me.
Civilization, are we really civilized? Yes or no? Who will be the judge? When thousands of innocent men can be brutally enslaved or killed over a racist grudge. Mr. Wendell has tried to warn us about our ways, but we don't hear him talk. Is it his fault when we've gone too far and we got too far, cause on him we walk.
It's sort of a common critique of capitalism that you can't really have any success without necessarily excluding others from that success or stepping on other people in order to hold your position. I don't know if the group necessarily goes that far, but that is the way that the argument is presented in the song. This is the song People Every Day, the Metamorphosis mix. The album version contained a different mix of this song, but this is the one that got popular. This one actually does sample Sly and the Family Stone's Everyday People. Basically a story about walking through the park and sort of being coerced into violence. Basically a song calling out black-on-black violence and gangster mentalities, things like that. It's another one of the stances that this group had that was somewhat controversial at the time, and it won them probably just as many fans as it did detractors. I mean, they were a very Afrocentric group, so they dressed up in a lot of bright colors, and this was sort of a fashion trend of going back to more African-style fashions, I think, among the black community. This was something that you saw a little bit of in the early 90s, and this group was definitely part of that. So in the song, basically, he gets dissed because of his clothes and ends up having a fight. Yeah, and then they basically start moving in on his girl, and that's when he has to resort to violence. His speech always sounded way too chill to do anything violent whatsoever. I think it's really meant to be a reflection of reality, which is always the argument that's used when people defend gangsta rap, is like saying, well, that's how it really is in the ghetto. And this group really explicitly positioned themselves as an alternative to that. So you can see why this would be their approach to telling a story about violence that is part of their experience.
Cause I don't like killing Africans, but he wouldn't stop, and I ain't Ice Cube, but I had to take the brother out for being rude.
The debut album, 3 years, 5 months, and 2 days in the life of, was a huge success. It went about quadruple platinum. And the group won 2 Grammys for Best New Artist and Best Rap Song for the song Tennessee. Of course, during all this time, gangsta rap is blowing up huge. Dr. Dre released The Chronic the very same year. So Arrested Development are really one of these fascinating alternate history bands where if it hadn't been for Dr. Dre coming out with that album, who knows like whether their style of hip-hop would have proven to be more influential or would have stuck around a little bit longer. But by the time they released their follow-up album called Zingala Maduni, this band is really dedicated to album titles that do not roll off the tongue. In 1994, it was pretty much the opposite of the success that they had at the debut album. It was your classic sophomore slump. The album debuted at about number 55 on the album charts, so they really went from being the most popular group in their genre for a brief time to just being complete nobodies or completely washed up within only a couple of years, and then they broke up in about 1995. It's too bad because in a lot of ways, Zingala Maduni is a better album than 3 years, 5 months, and 2 days in the life of. Production is a little more advanced, it's a little more modern, doesn't sound quite as dated as the early 90s production that you sometimes have on that album. Their structures are a little bit better, and their songs in general are a little more darker, denser, a little more layered. Here's a song, Pride. They incorporated a little bit of this tribal-sounding percussion or a little bit of this quasi-African-sounding chanting. The music did get a lot mellower. It didn't sound very commercial. I can sort of see why the album didn't do that well. Both of their albums are pretty good to me, honestly, but I probably prefer this one. Speeches, rhymes, and flows get a little better on this album, or they get a little more complex. He's just doing more interesting things with his voice, I think, on here.
Never be no curse, no it can't. I wear it like a prom tuxedo and I wear my hair as if it's the sun and each and every dread is a powerful light ray.
This is the song United Front. Also illustrates sort of the progression of their sound into something a little more jazzy, layered, and interesting. So to their credit, it's not like they were stuck in 1992. They were moving their sound forward, definitely. I think maybe if they stuck it out for about one more album, they probably could have recaptured some of their old popularity. They seem to have good enough instincts to do that. They also seem to be getting a little more diverse on this album. The melodies are a little funkier. The structures are a little more different. But the album sold horribly. I don't think you can even find a copy of this at a used record store because so few people bought it in the first place. And the group broke up the following year in 1995. Speech released his first solo album in 1996 called Speech. This is the track Like Marvin Gaye Said. What's going on?
crime of the mind.
And here you can just see that the production isn't nearly as good as it was in the two Arrested Development albums. Speech and Headliner never really worked together after their second album. Even after the group reunited in 2000, Headliner still has never returned. They reunited without him. I hope they brought back Baba O'Jay, though. That would have been cool. To me, the most notable song by an Arrested Development affiliate, by someone who wasn't even an official member of the band, is the song I Know by Dion Ferris from her debut album, Wild Seed, Wildflower. You may have heard this one before. It's just a really cool, diverse song. It incorporates parts of soul, blues, guitar, rock music. It's just a really unique 90s thing that I don't think you would have gotten any other decade. She had a great voice. This was the most successful track from someone's post-Arrested Development career, although she wasn't officially a member of the band to begin with. But she's still considered part of their collective from when they were originally recording. I should really do a video just on Dion Ferris. I think this would be an interesting one to do. So that was pretty much it for them in the 90s. They did reunite, like I said, in 2000. Apparently they found a really big following in Japan. Every album they release has a song that hit the top 10 in that country. Good old Japan, always, supporting the artists that maybe America wasn't quite ready for. I know it's a cliche joke, but there's a reason for it. So that's the inspirational message I think to take from this band's story, is if your musical career doesn't quite work out, take it over to Japan, who knows? They might see something in you that the United States does not. I'm almost positive that Arrested Development's original intention was not to become big international superstars in Japan of all places, but it just goes to show you that you never know how things are going to work out, especially in an artist's career. Next time on Bad 90s Music, the Jake Wayo has an idea for a new series.